There was once a boy named Rayan who lived in a small village near the edge of a dark forest. The people in his village were simple farmers and traders. They woke up with the sun, worked in their fields, and went to sleep when the sky turned black. Life was not easy, but it was quiet. Only one thing made their hearts heavy. Every few years, a terrible war came close to their land, and soldiers marched past with metal armor, sharp swords, and cold eyes. When Rayan was very young, he saw soldiers for the first time, and from that moment, fear started living inside him like a shadow. Rayan was scared of almost everything. He was scared of loud thunder, of barking dogs, of strangers on the road, and even of deep water in the river. When other children played near the forest, he stayed back and watched. When they climbed trees, he stayed safely on the ground. They laughed at him sometimes and called him Little Mouse because he always ran away when he heard something that frightened him. Rayan did not enjoy being afraid, but he did not know how to be brave. For him, danger was like a big black hand that pulled his thoughts away from courage. His father, however, was very different. His father's name was Farid, and he had once been a warrior. Long before Rayan was born, Farid had fought in many battles. He had scars on his arms and a small white line on his cheek where a sword had once cut him. But when Rayan looked into his father's eyes, he did not see violence. He saw kindness and quiet strength. Farid worked in the fields like any other man and told very few stories about his past. Only sometimes, when the wind was strong and the night was cold, he would sit by the fire and speak softly about courage. One such night, when Rayan was about 10 years old, he sat close to his father and asked, "Were you never afraid in battle?" His voice was small but serious. Farid looked at him for a long moment and then smiled a little. "Of course I was afraid," Farid said. "Every warrior is afraid. Only a fool feels nothing." "Then how did you fight?" Rayan asked. "How did you stand when death was near?" Farid put a rough hand on Rayan's shoulder. "You think bravery is the absence of fear? It is not. Bravery is choosing what you will do even while fear screams inside you. One day you will understand." Rayan bit his lip and looked at the fire. He did not feel brave. He felt small and weak. How could someone like him ever stand in front of danger? He could not even stand near a barking dog without his heart shaking. But his father's words stayed in his mind like a soft echo. A few years later, everything changed. When Rayan was 15, rumors of war began to spread again. Travelers who passed by their village spoke of a cruel warlord named Kardar who was moving from land to land, taking control and leaving fear behind him. His soldiers were many, and everyone said they had no mercy. Villagers began to worry. Some spoke of leaving, but they had nowhere safe to go. Others hoped that Kardar would never come near them, but hope alone cannot stop marching boots. One late afternoon, as the sun was falling and painting the sky in red and orange, a tired rider entered the village. His horse was breathing hard, and dust covered his clothes. He shouted for the people to gather. When everyone came out of their homes, he told them, with a heavy voice, that Kardar's army was moving toward their valley. They had maybe a week, maybe less, before the soldiers reached them. Fear fell on the village like a cold rain. That night, the elders of the village held a meeting in the small square. Rayan listened from the back, his heart beating fast. Some said they should hide in the forest. Others said they should send gifts and ask for peace. A few strong men, including Rayan's father, said they should prepare to defend their homes. "If we bow to a cruel man once," Farid said, "we will bow to him forever. Our children will grow up in chains." His words were strong, but many were afraid. Rayan could feel fear growing in his stomach. Soldiers, death, war. These were not simple worries anymore. They were real and coming closer. When the meeting ended, he walked home with his father in silence. The stars were bright, but the world felt dark. Inside their home, Rayan finally spoke. "Father, will you fight again?" Farid nodded slowly. "If I must. I am not young, but my hands can still hold a sword. I cannot watch others protect my family while I stand back." Rayan swallowed. "You always said bravery is choosing what you do even when you are afraid." "Yes," Farid replied gently. "Why do you ask?" Rayan looked at his own hands. They were not strong like his father's. They were not used to weapons, only to tools. "I am afraid of everything," he whispered, "but I don't want to live my whole life running away. I don't want you to stand in front of danger alone." Farid's eyes softened. "Rayan, you are still young. No one will blame you for staying safe. But I will blame myself," Rayan answered, surprising both of them with his own words. "If danger comes to our home and I hide, I will never forget it. I will never forgive myself. I want to try. I want to learn to stand, even if my legs shake." For a long moment, Farid said nothing. Then, slowly, he smiled, not with joy, but with quiet pride. "Then tomorrow at first light, we begin," he said. "You will train with me. You will learn not to escape fear, but to walk with it." That night, Rayan did not sleep well. His mind was full of pictures, swords, shouting, dark smoke, and his own body falling on the ground. He imagined death coming close, cold, and quiet. But somewhere in those shadows, he also saw his father's face and heard his words again. Bravery is not the absence of fear. It is choosing what you will do even while fear screams. Se lay awake. He did not know it yet, but this was the beginning of his journey. The boy who was afraid of everything had taken his first step toward becoming the warrior, who would one day laugh in the face of death. Training began the next morning before the sun had fully risen. The sky was still pale, and the air was cold enough to bite the skin. Rayan stood in the small open field behind their house, shivering not only from the cold but also from nervousness. His father brought an old wooden practice sword and handed it to him. It felt heavier than Rayan expected. His fingers curled around the rough handle, and he wondered how warriors carried metal swords for hours. Farid stood in front of him with his own practice sword. First, he said, you must learn how to stand. If your feet are weak, your heart will follow. Strong feet, strong mind. He showed Rayan how to spread his legs a little, how to bend his knees, how to keep his weight balanced. Rayan tried to copy him. At first he felt clumsy, his legs shook, and his arms felt awkward. But his father was patient. Hour after hour, they practiced simple moves. Stand, step forward, step back, lift the sword, block, lower the sword. Again and again, until the movements began to feel less strange. The sun climbed higher, then slowly began to fall again. Rayan's muscles burned, and his hands were sore, but something inside him was changing. With every step, his fear still whispered, but now, another voice, a quieter one, began to answer, keep going. Day after day, they trained. When Rayan's arms grew stronger, Farid began to teach him how to watch his opponents, how to move with the flow of a fight instead of only reacting blindly. He taught him how to breathe calmly, even when his heart was racing fast. Death is not the first thing you meet in battle, Farid said. You meet your own fear first. If you do not learn to greet it, you will lose before the enemy even touches you. Sometimes, during rest, they sat in the shade of a tree, and Farid told him short stories about his time as a warrior. He did not speak like a hero. He spoke like a man who had seen too much and still chose kindness. He told Rayan how many brave men had died, not because they lacked strength, but because they lost their minds to panic. A calm mind sees doors where fear sees only walls, he said. Meanwhile, the village slowly prepared itself. Men and older boys trained with sticks and old weapons. Women gathered food and bandages, ready for hard days. Some people still hoped that Kardar's army would pass them by, but most understood that hope alone was not a shield. The village built small wooden walls and dug ditches. Every evening, news arrived from nearby places, and each time, the news was darker. Kardar's army was growing. Villages that did not obey him were burned or taken. The fear that lived deep inside Rayan was now walking openly through every street. One afternoon, as Rayan and his father trained, a group of village youth came to watch. Some of them were the same boys who once called him Little Mouse. They whispered among themselves, surprised to see him holding a sword and not running away. After a while, one of them, a tall boy named Jamal, stepped forward and asked, Rayan, are you really going to fight with us when the army comes? Rayan lowered his sword, breathing hard. He was still panting from the last exercise. Yes, he said simply. His voice was tired but steady. I don't know if I will be good enough. I don't know if I will live, but I will stand with my father and with you. Jamal scratched his head, unsure how to react. You were always the scared one, he said. Not cruelly, but honestly. I am still scared, Rayan answered. But running away from fear has not helped me. So now I will walk toward it and see what happens. The boys looked at each other, surprised by his words. There was something different in him now, something new that they could not easily name. It was not that his fear was gone. It was that he was learning to stand in spite of it. That night, as they sat by the fire, Rayan asked his father, Do you think I will be ready when the army comes? Farid looked at him with serious eyes. No one is ever fully ready for war, he said, but you are ready to choose. From that choice, strength will come. Rayan nodded slowly, feeling both comforted and unsettled. He went to sleep with his practice sword beside his bed, as if its presence could protect his dreams. Days turned into weeks, and the signs of approaching war grew stronger. Smoke could sometimes be seen far away on the horizon, where other villages had already faced Kardar's army. Tired travelers passed through, bringing stories of surrender and resistance, of fear and bravery, of people who chose to kneel and people who chose to fight. One evening, a man with a scar across his eye arrived at the village square. He wore broken armor and carried a sword stained with old battles. He introduced himself as Darren, a former captain who had escaped after his town was taken by Kardar's forces. The elders welcomed him and asked for news. His voice was heavy as he said, Kardar does not only want land, he wants to break people's spirit. He loves to see fear in their eyes. Rayan listened quietly from the edge of the crowd. The word fear struck him like a familiar enemy. Darren continued, Once, when we were surrounded and close to death, one of my men did something strange. He began to laugh. He laughed loudly, right there in front of certain death. Kardar's men thought he had gone mad, but his laughter gave the rest of us courage. For a moment, it broke the power of fear. The image of a man laughing in the face of death burned itself into Rayan's mind. It was wild, almost unbelievable. How could anyone laugh when death was so near? Yet Darren's eyes shone with respect when he spoke of that man, as if the memory still warmed his heart. That night, Rayan asked his father about it. Is it really possible, he said, to laugh in the face of death? Farid smiled softly. A rare few can. It is not the laugh of a fool, but the laugh of someone who has chosen his path so completely that even death cannot scare him away from it. That is the highest form of courage, Rayan. But even if you never laugh, standing your ground is enough. Rayan lay awake for a long time after that. Somewhere deep inside, a strange wish began to groan, not only to stand in the face of death, but to reach that kind of courage where fear loses its voice. He did not know if it would ever be possible for him, the boy who once trembled at every sound, but he kept training. He kept choosing, again and again, to stay, to stand, to learn. He did not know that the day was coming when death would stand close enough to touch, and in that moment, his heart would give him its final answer. War did not arrive with sudden thunder. It came slowly, step by step, like a dark cloud crawling across the sky. First, the village heard the distant sound of marching feet, like faraway thunder that never stopped. Then they saw dust on the horizon, a wide brown line where the earth was being broken by the weight of many boots. Finally, one cold morning, Kardar's army appeared like a gray wave at the edge of the valley. From the hill outside the village, Rayan stood beside his father and the other men, watching the army move closer. Rows upon rows of soldiers, shields shining dully, spears pointed up like a forest of metal. Banners with Kardar's symbol and iron fist fluttered in the wind. Rayan had imagined this moment many times in his nightmares, but now that it was here, everything felt strangely sharp and clear. He could hear his own breathing. He could feel the weight of his sword on his side. Fear was there too, of course, sitting heavy in his chest, but it did not control his legs. They did not run. What do we do now? Jamal whispered beside him, his voice shaking. We remember why we are standing here, Farid said calmly. We are not fighting for glory. We are fighting so that our home is not taken, so that our children do not grow up under a cruel man's shadow. The plan was simple. The village defenders, only a small group of farmers and old warriors, would block the main road and show that they would not surrender east. They knew they could not defeat a whole army, but they hoped to force Kardar to speak, to agree to some kind of peace, or at least to pass by. Deep down, many of them also knew that they might die, but they chose to stand anyway. As Kardar's army drew near, a trumpet sounded, and the soldiers stopped at a distance. From the center of the formation, a tall man rode forward on a black horse. He wore heavy armor and a dark red cloak. Even from far away, his presence felt cold and heavy. This was Kardar. He looked at the small group of villagers standing on the road and laughed, but it was not a warm laugh. It was sharp and cruel. He raised his voice so that they could hear. Is this all? He shouted. A handful of farmers with old swords? Farid stepped forward carefully, keeping his blade lowered in a sign of respect but not submission. We are simple people, he called back. We ask that you pass by our homes in peace. We have nothing that will make you richer. We only want to live. Kardar tilted his head. You have land. You have young bodies that can serve in my army. You have daughters who can work in my houses. You have sons who can die for my name. You think you have nothing? You have everything I want. A cold anger rose in Rayan's chest, mixing with fear. He gripped his sword tighter. Farid's voice was still calm, but there was steel in it now. We will not kneel, he said. We will not give our lives to a man who enjoys crushing others. If you want our land, you will have to step over our bodies. Kardar's face hardened. He looked at the small group of villagers again, then shrugged. So be it, he said. He raised his hand, and the first line of soldiers began to move forward. Rayan felt his body scream at him to run. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of boots and the shine of blades. But then he heard his father's voice beside him. Remember your training. Remember your choice. Rayan drew his sword. The first clash of metal rang through the air like a cruel bell. The village defenders met the soldiers with all the strength they had. Swords hit shields, spears were pushed aside. Men shouted, grunted, fell, stood again. Rayan found himself face to face with a soldier much bigger than him. The man swung his weapon hard, and Rayan blocked it just in time, the force making his arms tremble. Fear roared inside him, but his body moved as his father had taught him. Step back, step to the side, block, strike. The battle felt like a storm. There was no time to think of anything except the next movement, the next breath. Once Rayan slipped in the dirt and almost fell, but Farid's hand pulled him up from behind. Stand, his father shouted, and Rayan did. Despite their courage, the villagers were outnumbered. Slowly, step by step, they were pushed back. Rayan saw Jamal fall to his knees, then struggled to stand again. He saw Darren fighting like a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. He saw men he had known all his life bleed and fall. Every time someone fell, anger burned hotter inside him, eating away at his fear. At one point, Rayan became separated from his father in the chaos. He looked around, but there were too many bodies, too much movement. Panic tried to grab him again, but he forced himself to focus on the enemy in front of him. A soldier swung toward his head, and Rayan ducked, then struck the man's arm hard enough to make him drop his weapon. Another came at him, and Rayan blocked, feeling his hands ache. Suddenly, there was a shout, louder than the rest. Kardar had ridden closer to watch the battle, enjoying the villagers' struggle like a cruel game. When he saw that they still refused to kneel, even as their numbers grew smaller, he laughed again. Look at them, he called to his men. They choose death over serving me. What foolish courage. Those words reached Rayon's ears like a spark. Something inside him snapped, not in fear, but in a strange, wild way. He was tired, covered in sweat and dust, his arms heavy, his body close to breaking. Death was close. He could feel it. Any moment a blade could find him. Any moment his life could end. For a second, he saw his whole journey, his childhood fear, his father's lessons, the image of the man who laughed in the face of death. A thought came to him, clear and sharp. If I must die, I will not give fear the last word. And then, in the middle of blood and dust and shouting, Rayon did something completely unexpected. He laughed at first. It was a small sound, weak and almost broken, but then it grew, rising from deep in his chest. It was not the laugh of a madman. It was a laugh of freedom, of someone who had finally accepted that death was not the real enemy. Fear was. He laughed at the absurdity of a cruel man thinking he could own people's spirits. He laughed at the idea that fear could still control him after everything he had lived through. Nearby soldiers turned to look at him, surprised. Some of them hesitated, confused by the sound of laughter, in a place where no one should be laughing. Kardar himself noticed and stared at the young villager, who stood with a sword in his shaking hands and a strange light in his eyes. Rayon lifted his blade, still laughing, and shouted, "You may take my life, but you will never own my fear." Those words cut through the noise like a blade of their own. In that moment, the boy who had been afraid of everything became something else entirely. For a brief, bright moment, time seemed to slow around Rayon. His laughter echoed strangely over the battlefield, mixing with the shouts and cries. Soldiers who had been moving forward with hard faces now stopped, uncertain. It was as if his laughter had cracked the air and sent a small shock into their hearts. Rayon felt completely alive. He was aware of every breath, every drop of sweat, every beat of his heart. Death still stood beside him, close enough to touch, but it no longer felt like a dark hand squeezing his throat. Instead, it felt like a silent witness, watching to see what he would choose. Kardar's eyes narrowed as he watched the young villager. "Bring me that boy," he ordered coldly. Two soldiers rushed at Rayon. He lifted his sword, his body tired but his spirit burning. The first soldier attacked with a wide swing, and Rayon ducked under it, striking back with all the force he had learned in training. The second came from the side, and Rayon blocked, feeling the heavy clash of metal. He laughed again, not because the fight was easy, but because he refused to let fear fill his final moments. Nearby, some villagers who could still stand heard his laughter and felt something rise in their own chests. Jamal, bleeding from a cut on his arm, gritted his teeth and pushed forward with new strength. Darren shouted and struck harder, his tired body suddenly filled with fresh fire. Even Farid, who had been knocked to one knee, heard his son's laughter and looked up with wide eyes. When he saw Rayon standing like that, small against the enemy but unbroken, something like pride and pain filled his heart at the same time. "That's my son," he whispered. The soldiers who fought Rayon were confused. They had faced many men who begged for mercy, many who screamed in fear, many who cursed the sky. But this boy, with dust on his face and a thin line of blood on his forehead, was laughing. Their strikes grew weaker, their focus shaken. Fear began to move quietly into their own hearts now, not from death, but from the strange power of someone who accepted it. Rayon's arms felt like burning iron. Every movement hurt. His legs were shaking, his lungs were tight, but he kept going. His laughter slowly faded as his breath grew shorter, but the fire it had lit inside him did not go out. He moved with a calm he had never known before. He no longer fought to save his own life. He fought because this was the path he had chosen. He fought as a free man. Finally, one of Kardar's elite guards stepped forward. He was taller, stronger, and more experienced than the others. He wore better armor and carried a heavy sword. "Enough of this," he growled. He pushed the other soldiers aside and approached Rayon with slow, confident steps. The guard attacked with strong, precise blows. Rayon blocked the first, dodged the second, but the third hit his shoulder, sending a sharp pain through his body. He stumbled but did not fall. He looked up, breathing hard, and smiled, not a big smile, but a tired, knowing one. "Is that all?" he whispered. The guard frowned, angered by the boy's courage. He raised his sword again. This time, Rayon moved slower. He could feel his strength leaving him. The blow knocked his sword from his hand, sending it spinning into the dirt. The sound of metal hitting the ground was loud in his ears. For a moment, everything was quiet inside him. He was unarmed. The guard raised his sword for the final strike. Death stood even closer now, its presence like a cold breeze on his skin. And still, Rayon did not close his eyes. He did not beg. Instead, he did one last thing. He laughed again. It was a soft laugh, broken by pain, but it was real. It was the laughter of someone who had made his choice and did not regret it. In that last second, he remembered his childhood fears, his father's hand on his shoulder, the training in the field, the stories of the man who laughed in the face of death. He realized that he had become that story. As the guard began to bring the sword down, a shout rang out. "No!" Farid rushed in from the side with all the speed his body could give him. He blocked the blow aimed at his son with his own sword. The force of it drove him to one knee, but he did not let go. Darren and Jamal appeared next, attacking the guard from both sides. Taken by surprise, the guard stumbled, and together they brought him down. Rayan fell to the ground, breathing hard, his body exhausted. His father dropped beside him, eyes full of worry. "Rayan, stay with me." Rayan smiled weakly. "I'm still here," he whispered. "I thought it was my end." Farid's voice shook. "You foolish, brave boy," he said, half angry, half proud. "What were you doing?" Rayan looked up at the sky, where clouds moved slowly, ignoring the battle below. "Laughing," he said softly. "I didn't want fear to win, father. Not this time. Not ever again." Round them, something was happening. The sight of a young warrior laughing in the face of death, refusing to bow, and then being saved by his people had changed the air on the battlefield. The villagers, though tired and wounded, now fought with renewed strength. The soldiers of Kardar, on the other hand, felt doubt creeping into their hearts. If even simple villagers would not kneel, how long would this warlord hold power? Kardar watched all of this from his horse. His face was hard, but inside he felt a small, unfamiliar sting. It was not fear of death. He had seen death too often. It was fear of something else, fear of losing control over people's hearts. He had always ruled through fear, but here was proof that fear could be broken by courage. He raised his hand again and signaled his hornblower. A sharp sound cut through the battle. Slowly, the soldiers began to pull back. The fighting grew weaker, then stopped. The villagers, surprised, did not chase them. Kardar's voice carried across the field. "Enough for today," he called. "This village has more spirit than I expected. Keep your land for now, but remember my name. One day, I may return." With that, he turned his horse and rode away, his army moving behind him like a retreating storm. The villagers stood, stunned and panting, surrounded by the heavy quiet that comes after chaos. Rayan lay in his father's arms, still alive, still breathing. He had expected death. Instead, he had found something else, his true self. In the days that followed, people in the village and beyond began to tell a new story. They spoke of the boy who had once been afraid of everything, who stood on a road covered in dust and blood and laughed in the face of death. They called him the warrior who laughed, and his story traveled like a small light into dark places. Rayhan did not feel like a legend. He felt like a person who had made a hard choice and survived it. But as he healed, he began to understand that sometimes one person's courage can give strength to many others. Time moved on. The wounds of the battle slowly healed, both on the bodies of the villagers and on the land itself. The dead were buried with honor, their names whispered with respect. The living returned to their fields, their animals, their daily work. But nothing was quite the same as before. The village had stood against a great fear and had not broken. A new kind of strength lived in their hearts now. As for Rayhan, he spent many weeks recovering. His shoulder was badly injured, and his body was weak from exhaustion. During those days, he stayed mostly in bed or sat outside in the sunlight, breathing the clean air and listening to the sounds of normal life. Children playing, women talking, men laughing. Simple sounds, but they felt like gifts. People came to visit him often. Jamal, with his arm in a bandage, sat beside him and said, "I used to think you were the most frightened boy in the village. Now I know you are the bravest of us all." Rayhan shook his head. "I was terrified," he said honestly. "Every second. The difference is, I decided to move anyway." Darren came too, the scar on his eye catching the light. "You reminded me of my old comrade," he told Rayhan, "the one who laughed before he died. But you did something more. Your laughter did not only mark your end, it changed the battle itself. You showed everyone that fear is not a king, it is only a voice, and we can choose whether to obey it." Children from the village sometimes sneaked close to listen from the doorway. To them, Rayhan already seemed like a hero from a storybook, but he always spoke simply. "I am just like you," he told them. "I was scared of everything once. I still get scared sometimes. But now I know that fear does not decide who I am. I do." When he was strong enough to walk without help, Rayhan returned to the training field behind his house. His father stood there waiting, to practice swords in his hands. "You want to stop?" Farid asked him. "Or you want to keep training?" Rayhan looked at the worn ground where his journey had begun. He remembered the first days when he could barely lift the sword, when his legs shook, and his mind was full of doubt. Then he remembered the battlefield, the sound of his own laughter, the look in Kardar's eyes as fear lost power over one small man. He shook his head. "I want to keep going," he said. "Not for war, for life. If fear ever comes again, I want to meet it with open eyes." Farid smiled, his eyes shining. "You have already walked farther than many warriors," he said, "but there is always more to learn." As the years passed, Rayhan became known as someone people trusted in times of danger. When storms hit the valley, people looked to him for calm decisions. When wild animals came too close to the village, he helped drive them away. When arguments grew heated, he listened and spoke with the same steady voice he had used on the battlefield. He did not seek power or control. He simply offered courage and clarity wherever he could. Stories about the warrior who laughed in the face of death spread beyond the valley. Travelers carried the tale to other villages, and from there it moved like a river, reaching places Rayhan would never see. In some versions of the story, he was described as a giant with fire in his eyes. In others, he fought 10 men at once and never fell. These details were not true, but the heart of the story was, somewhere, once, a frightened boy had chosen to laugh instead of kneel. Many years later, when Rayan was older and his hair had begun to turn gray, a group of young people from another town came to visit. They had heard the story and wanted to meet the man himself. They found him sitting on a wooden bench outside his home, watching the sun go down. "Master Rayan," one of them said respectfully, "they say you were never afraid. They say you laughed at death because you did not care about your life." Rayan smiled gently at that. "The people who say that do not know the truth," he replied. "I cared a great deal about my life. I was afraid many times. Fear is natural, but I learned something important. Life is not only about staying alive, it is about how you stand while you are alive." The young people listened quietly. Rayan continued, "Fear will always knock at your door. Sometimes it will shout, sometimes it will whisper. It will tell you to kneel, to run, to hide. Most of the time, it will sound very convincing. But you must remember this. Fear is a teacher, not a master. It shows you where your courage is needed. When you feel fear, it does not mean you are weak. It means you have a chance to choose strength." One of the young women asked, "And what about laughing in the face of death? How can someone do that?" Rayan looked out at the fields, where children were playing, just as he once had. "Laughter is the purest form of freedom," he said softly. "When you know who you are, when you accept that you cannot escape death forever, but you can decide how you meet it, then something inside you becomes light. You may not always laugh. You may only stand quietly, but in your heart, you will have already defeated fear." He turned back to them and added with a small smile, "Do not try to be like the stories. Try to be honest with yourself. That is where true courage is born." That evening, after the visitors left, Rayhan sat with his father by the fire, just as they had done many years before. Farid was very old now, his hands thin, his voice soft, but his eyes were still clear. "You have gone farther than I ever dreamed," Farid said. "When you were a child, afraid of every sound, I worried for you. But now I see that sometimes, the people who know fear best can become the bravest of all, because they do not lie to themselves. They feel fear and still move forward." Rayhan reached out and took his father's hand. "You gave me the first step," he replied. "You showed me that bravery is not a magic thing. It is a choice, made again and again. I only walked the road you pointed to." The fire crackled softly between them. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a gentle sound, nothing like the harsh march of war boots. The valley was peaceful. In the end, Rayhan did not become famous in the way kings and conquerors do. His name did not appear in great books written in golden ink, but in the hearts of the people who heard his story, he lived as something even more important. A reminder that the child who fears everything can still grow into someone who stands firm. A reminder that death is not as strong as a free spirit. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, a human being can choose courage so complete that it turns fear into something small. And so, when people told his story around fires on cold nights, they ended it with the same line, spoken with quiet respect. They saw a frightened boy, he became a warrior. And on the day death came close, he did not bow, he laughed in its face. And in that laugh, he became a legend.